Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. This is a great episode this week, especially, well, I hope they're all great, but this one especially I'm very excited about because I got to interview Dr. J.P. Moreland on his recent book on anxiety, Finding Quiet. And if you're not familiar, J.P. Moreland is an exceptionally prominent and influential philosopher, especially in the philosophy of mind. He teaches at Biola University in California, and he's a very prolific author. He's written many articles and books, some of which I've read, but not all of them. And the ones I've read have been very good, and I couldn't recommend them more, so I'm sure the ones I haven't are good too. So he was able to spare me, he said that he was able to spare me 30 minutes, and we actually wound up talking a little bit longer than that. So my thanks to Dr. Moreland again for being willing to spare me the time to talk to me about his book, because he's a very prominent philosopher, and he doesn't have to talk to me or anybody else if he doesn't want to. So I really, really appreciate him being willing to do that, and thank you again for taking the time to talk to me, Dr. Moreland. Now, real quick before I get into the interview I did with Dr. Moreland, I've decided I'm going to start a new little segment on the show here, and I think I should be able to do this every week, and I'm just going to do it for fun, and that is, well, mostly for fun, but I think it'll be instructive too, and that is Calvin and Hobbes and philosophy. Now, for people who aren't aware, because it is getting a little old now, Calvin and Hobbes was an absolutely brilliant and amazing comic strip that ran from about I want to say the mid-'80s to the early '90s, written by Bill Watterson, about a little kid named Calvin, who I think he was supposed to be 6, who was a very smart aleck kid, and he had a stuffed tiger named Hobbes, and when Calvin was by himself with Hobbes, Hobbes was alive and talking to him, and when parents were around, Hobbes was just a stuffed tiger. And it's a very hilarious, but at the same time, often would make some pretty profound and interesting statements about life, theology, and philosophy, and things like that, in only 3 or 4 panels of a comic strip. And so I've been wanting to do something on Calvin and Hobbes and philosophy for quite some time. I've toyed around with it in various formats, because it's really quite exceptional that, well, here, I'll just give you an example. What I'm going to do is, since this is an audio podcast, I'll read off and describe to you the comic strip, but I'm also going to put up an image of it on the Facebook page so you can go see it there. So here's an example of how good this is. I spent roughly 12 hours of content going through the problem of divine foreknowledge with 5 different guests, and wasn't able to come to as much of a conclusion as I would like. Well, here's Bill Watterson talking about the problem of divine foreknowledge in just 4 strips of a panel. Hobbes and Calvin are walking, and Calvin says to Hobbes, "I've decided to become a fatalist. All events are preordained and unalterable. Whatever will be, will be. That way, if anything bad happens, it's not my fault. It's fate." Then Hobbes trips Calvin and knocks him on the ground. And Hobbes leans over and says to a dirtied, roughed-up Calvin lying on the ground, "Too bad you were fated to do that." Calvin screams back at him, "That wasn't fate." So I read that comic and think, yeah, that kind of knocks down a lot of determinism right there, in the sense that at least none of us actually believe that when we're really confronted with the world, we don't actually in any way act deterministic. Reminds me, back about 2-3 years ago, I went through Sam Harris's book on free will, and I just could not get over how often he contradicted himself, because Sam Harris is a complete determinist who doesn't believe in free will, and I kept wanting to say to him, as I was going through the book, well, who wrote your book then? Obviously nobody did. If you were just determined to do it, then there's no difference between your book and the way a tree grew or something. The only difference is the mechanicalistic human, that is Sam Harris, wrote the book, and the tree did something else. There's no distinction there. There is no agency behind it, so how can I take your argument seriously? And so I'm going to do one of these every week, I think, if I can find one anyway, and I'm going to try and make it something that's relevant to the topic at hand. So since this week I'm talking to J.P. Moreland about anxiety, I found a Calvin and Hobbes strip that's talking about anxiety. Hobbes and Calvin are walking through the woods. Again, they do that a lot in these strips. And Calvin says, "I think people worry too much about little things. All they do is make themselves unhappy that way. Why get it an ulcer over things that don't really matter?" And Hobbes says back to him, "Like the book report you're supposed to be writing now on the book you haven't read." Calvin replies, "Exactly, case in point." Now, I could actually give Calvin a facepalm and sigh award here for the logical fallacy he's doing, because it starts with a very great point, which I think Dr. Moreland alluded to in our interview, that, yeah, you shouldn't worry so much. You should find ways to not make yourself unhappy by worrying, by being anxious, by having to deal with this. And for some people, it's much more difficult than others. But there are some things that actually you should worry about in the sense of trying to do something about them, like in Calvin's case, reading the book and writing his book report for school. So there's a pretty big distinction between worrying about if an asteroid's going to hit the Earth in 5 or 10 years, or if the Yellowstone supervolcano is going to blow up, and worrying about how you're going to pay the bills next week if you don't have a job. Well, the answer is go do something about it. Go get a job. So that's what I'm going to do with this segment. Sometimes it'll probably get a little bit longer because some of these Calvin and Hobbes strips actually wind up alluding to and making very big, grand philosophical points that would probably need quite a lot of unpacking. This one doesn't so much. It's just kind of funny and clever, and that's fine. So I hope you like this segment, and if not, well, I think I'm going to keep doing it anyway because I really like Calvin and Hobbes, and more people need to become aware of it. So without any further ado, on to my interview with Dr. J.P. Moreland. I'm very privileged to have with me this evening Dr. J.P. Moreland, who's a distinguished philosopher, who's a professor of philosophy at Biola University, and has written many, many books and many, many articles, some of which I've read, and all of the ones I've read, at least, were very, very good. So I'm very pleased to have him here with me this evening. How are you doing this evening, Dr. Moreland?
I'm doing well, and Phil, it's a joy to be with you.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. Now, for those of us, for listeners who might not be aware of who you are, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself quickly before we dive into the fun stuff?
Sure. I came to Christ at the University of Missouri as a chemistry major in 1968, and then joined staff with Campus Crusade for Christ. And as a result of evangelism and discipleship, I went into philosophy because I saw that was where most of the questions ended up. Mm-hmm. So I got my PhD in philosophy under Dallas Willard at USC, and I've been a professor at Biola University, Talbot School of Theology for 29 years.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. I have heard some of Dallas Willard's lectures and looked at a couple of his books, and that man was an absolute genius. I just loved everything I could get my hands on that he did. So
you're absolutely right.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving on. You're here to talk to us about your book, Finding Quiet, which is a book about dealing with anxiety and depression. And I worked my way through that, I didn't read it. I listened to the audiobook version while I was driving my family out to Denver on a vacation. But I really enjoyed it, and I'll admit that although I knew it was going to be about anxiety and depression, I was also kind of hoping Finding Quiet might give me some practical tips for how to have actual quiet in my house, because right now I've got 2 children under the age of 3, and it's not quiet here.
Good luck, dude.
Yeah, exactly. So, what is it that led you to write this book, and why did you think this was an important topic to explore?
Well, I was born with a genetic predisposition towards anxiety from my mother's side of the family. That didn't mean I had to become anxious, but it was just easier for me.
Okay.
And then my childhood was filled with some trauma. And so I've had a high-strung, sort of anxious personality most of my life, but it was always functional. But May 24th of 2003, to make a long story short, I had a nervous breakdown for 7 months.
Oh, wow.
And had panic attacks, and I didn't know what was going on. I just knew I was completely dysfunctional. Into counseling and got on some medication, and both helped me, and read the word. And eventually, after 7 months, I got better. 10 years later, the same thing happened to me. By the way, both were preceded by school years of tremendous stress. And they were right at the end of the school year. So it was a 5-month period, same thing. I had to quit my classes in the fall. And I sensed the Lord directing me to do research on this. And to boil down what I found into a set of ideas that may be fresh to people and start practicing them. And when they were woven into my own life, share them with his children. And the book Finding Quiet is my journey and some stuff that helped me that I don't think most people have heard about. So that's why I wrote it.
Okay, yeah, that's very great. And I found it was a very well-written book. I like your writing style in that you're not afraid to go in depth, and you're not afraid to like tackle the big and important subjects because hey, you're a philosopher of mind. But at the same time, at least this book was written in a way that I think is very accessible to non-academics and non-philosophers. I think just a normal everyday person who can read could read the book and understand exactly what you're talking about.
Well, that was my hope, and that's the feedback I'm getting, yes.
Good deal. Okay. So moving into some more of the topics here, you're a philosopher who's worked extensively in philosophy of mind. So what did you feel like you brought to the discussion or the study of anxiety and depression that like other people who don't have philosophical training or who don't work in philosophy of mind might have missed?
Well, it helped me to realize that that because I'm a soul, I have free will. Now, if I were just my brain, I'd be determined by the laws of chemistry and physics.
Yeah.
What that means is that there's hope for me and for those who are listening and watching who have anxiety and depression, because I am not my brain. Now, on the other hand, I am a very intimately embodied soul. And so what happens in my body will affect me. And so if my eyeballs are put out, I won't be able to see. My brain has grooves in it that are automatically trigger anxiety. I will feel that. So in the book, Phil, I try to lay out in an understandable way, a holistic biblical view of the person. And that view actually supports the use of medication and counseling, but also spiritual practices, because I'm a spiritual, psychological, and physical being. And that's what I try to lay out.
Okay, I see. So it's not in the sense of, I guess this would be kind of like a folk way of looking at it that often comes across in churches where people will say, well, I'm just my soul, the body's not important. And usually they don't actually like believe that in the strict sense, but it kind of functions that way. I've noticed where people will be like, oh, it's only about the soul, your body doesn't matter. You're kind of saying, well, no, it's both and.
Exactly right. That's exactly right.
Okay. And I really appreciated that part of the book where you started by going through some of the, and then you did it in a very easy and accessible way, where you went through the philosophical groundwork for the relationship between the body and the soul or the mind. But because you're such a great philosopher of mind, I can't resist asking you a more technical question, which is, what position do you tend to take on that? Are you a substance dualist? Do you take like a Thomistic or Aristotelian heliomorphism?
Yes.
Where do you come down on that?
Well, I have my own unique view. I call myself a peeping Thomist, which means that I'm not exactly a hylomorphist or where Aquinas is, but I have a view that is Thomistic-like. So I am a substance dualist in the sense that, not that there are two substances. There's only one substance, and it's the soul. But the body is an outgrowth of the soul. And I happen to hold the odd view that the soul contains your genetic information and it creates the body. And so the body is, the soul could exist without the body, but not vice versa. And the soul's functioning depends upon the body functioning while we're in the body. And so if my brain is chemistry's messed up, I will not be able to get over anxiety by an act of the will.
I see. That's interesting. So it's Thomistic-like in the sense that you're saying we're constructs where we're both the soul, well, not constructs, but we're both the soul and the body and not really reducible to either, but you're saying the soul is primary.
No, I'm saying
okay.
souls. We are souls. If that were not true, then in this intermediate state, we wouldn't exist. But are deeply intertwined with the body, which is not a completely separate substance. It's a dependent thing. It depends on the soul.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to dig into that some more. I got my master's degree from a Catholic seminary, and so I have a lot of Thomistic friends who keep trying to get me to come to around to their way of thinking. And I'm not quite there yet, but at the same time, they do have some very good points. So yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So just moving on, and if you have any other thoughts or points where you want to interject and interrupt me, please feel free. But it seemed to me from when I was working through your book there that most of the practical methods and advice you gave for dealing with anxiety, they kind of had a common thread or idea that of trying to find a way to process or deal with these things in a way that was a step or two removed from the event. So I took that to be something like we should neither ignore these negative emotions or the trauma, those kind of things, nor should we attempt to necessarily work through them in that moment, especially if you're overwhelmed or something unable to do that. And that's the 4-step solution you laid out and so on. Is that more or less right? Did I follow you? Okay.
Yes, you did. And let me just add, I think the main thing I learned is that anxiety is largely a learned habit that can be unlearned. And Paul says in Romans 6 to present the members of our body to God as instruments of shalom, righteousness, but well-being, flourishing. And the members of our body are our stomachs and our lungs and hearts. And the two members that we present to God to get rid of anxiety and depression are the brain and the heart muscle. Well, what does it mean to present them to God? It means that you engage in habits that I lay out 4 specific habits will retrain the grooves in your brain and your heart muscle, which are automatic. Those grooves right now automatically trigger depression and anxiety without you choosing it. And what you need to do is to find a way to get rid of that quote unquote muscle memory, if you will, and replace it with good muscle memory that automatically triggers peace and joy without you doing it. Well, how do you do that? Well, in sports, you go to a batting cage or a driving range. In music, you practice the scales. Well, in the spiritual life, you engage in repetitive practices over and over and over and over again until you form a new habit that gets rid of the bad habit. And those habits will be grooves in the members of your body. In this case, the brain and the heart, if we're dealing with anxiety and depression. The stomach is more related to anger. But if you regroove those, then what you're actually doing is forming Christ-like habits. Become automatic. They become part of your character. So you don't choose peace or joy. It just happens. It's just a part of you. It becomes the way you are. Well, what practices do you engage in? Well, I lay out 4 of them, and I don't know that we're going to have time to go over all 4 in detail, but I do lay those out and a whole bunch of other things in Finding Quiet. And one more thing, I think, Phil, that what excites me is that the book contains things that our brothers and sisters probably have not heard before. This is not a read. It's not an exhortation to take every thought captive to Christ without telling us how in the heck do you do that. So I think if it's a habit, I can unlearn it. If it's a learned habit, I can unlearn it. And the practices help do that.
Yeah. And I definitely agree with you that this isn't a rehash. I've certainly never read anything like this before, never got advice like this from any other Christians I've come in contact with. And I grew up in the church. My dad's a pastor in the Assemblies of God, and this is not in line with what people were saying anywhere. In fact, as we're talking about it, I think I would often get like bad advice that was very contrary to the kind of things you've written in your book. Like I don't I don't personally struggle with anxiety very much, but my wife occasionally has some struggles with that a little bit, where she'll feel anxious about things, and she's a physician in OBGYN, so that's a very stressful job sometimes.
Of course.
And I realized as I was working through your book that some of the advice I'd been trying to give her was kind of more or less in line with what you've been saying, where I would be like, well, spend 30 or 40 minutes every day where you don't do anything, where you just sit there and try and think through all these things, which it's not quite as practical and detailed as the advice you give. So it didn't always.
Right. It's in the right direction. That's for sure.
Yeah. That's what it occurred to me, and I realized that's the reason why I was telling her to do that. Is that's the way I'd been living life for 15 some odd years before my wife and I met, because I enjoy sitting and having quiet for an hour or so.
I bet. Well, good. Yeah. God bless you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, do you think there are any techniques that you found or practice that would be very effective that you thought were better than like some other ones that would be practically helpful for people who are struggling from this kind of stuff, who are dealing with anxiety and depression?
Well, you mentioned the 4-step solution, which is biblically rooted, and also it's something that was formulated by a Christian psychiatrist, and it has to do with what do you do with negative self-talk, and because that becomes such a habit. I'm a loser, or I'm just good, or I'm never going to get out of this. People at the office don't like me. Those kind of things. And after a while, you start getting afraid and anxious or depressed. And these become so habituated, Phil, that they fly under the radar and we're not even aware of them, but they have a massive impact. Well, how do you get rid of these? Well, there are 4 steps. And the first is that you have to invite the Spirit to help you become aware of them when they happen. And when you catch one, you have to label it as nothing but a triggered brain message. It's just a habit. It doesn't have anything to do with the people at the office. It's got nothing to do with whether the meeting you're going to fail tomorrow. It's to do with a habit, and that's all it is. Number 2, I list 10 thought distorters, and I can't go over them, but one of them is my favorite, and that's called catastrophizing. And so that's you. What if this and what if that's going to happen? Oh my gosh, that would be terrible. And then you spend all your time trying to worry about how you can protect yourself just in case this happens. And 95% of them, according to a study, don't happen. And so then I would label it. Now, wait a minute. All I'm doing is catastrophizing right now. This, again, it's nothing to do with reality. So that at that point, you turn away from the thought and you don't get down in the mud and fight with it, because ruminating over it causes the groove in your brain to go deeper and makes that self-talk harder to get rid of. And so what you want to do is to turn to something that gets you into what is called focus, or flow rather. And flow is when you're so into something, you lose track of time.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be spiritual. I mean, it could be reading a novel. It could be surfing the web. It could be going to your favorite website. It could be whatever, but it needs to be something that can get you caught up in it. Okay. Then after you've done that for a while, and you'll have to learn by trial and error, then you can go, the 4th step is that you can go back to the thought, because for that moment, it's not powerful anymore. Well, it might be tomorrow, but not right now. And you can evaluate how you did. Now, when you're forming a habit, learning to play tennis, Spanish, doing logic, becoming a cheerful, half full person instead of half empty, It takes practice, 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 practice.
Mm-hmm.
And what? You're going to be lousy at it. And in fact, the stuff you do to practice is going to be of no help almost for weeks until you get over the hump. Stick with it. Because, when you're first learning tennis, it's going to feel awkward and it's not going to be very helpful. You're going to be lousy. You got to stay with these, and they will change your life.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. It reminds me of back about 15, 20 years ago when I was in the military going through basic training, when they were teaching us how to shoot rifles. They didn't even start us off with rifles. They started us off with dummy rifles and how to just learn the ways to hold them for weeks and weeks and weeks before we actually touched a real one. Say again? Sorry?
What a great example.
Yeah. And then by the time we finally were actually shooting rifles, we already had most of the muscle memory down. We knew how they should feel and things like that. And then it was consequently a lot easier to actually hit the target. So.
Very true.
Okay.
And that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay. Makes perfect sense to me. So the next question I've got for you here is, I grew up in the evangelical community, and that's, Biola is an evangelical school. And I don't know how it is in other Christian communities, but in evangelicalism, there's definitely an aversion to taking prescription drugs for mental health, as you talk about in this book. So why do you think that is the case? Because I'm with you in saying that, no, that's something that you should definitely explore if it's going to help you. I mean, my wife's an OBGYN. I've seen it help people. So.
Absolutely. Well, I think two reasons. I think historically, psychology and psychiatry were seen to be atheistic or hostile to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Sigmund Freud, and you have other figures who have little regard for religion. And so I think the evangelical community in the 20s, 30s, up through the 60s or so, were hammered by psychology, and psychology threatened to take over spiritual practices. So instead of practicing, casting your anxiety on the Lord, you should do such and such. Deal with your defense mechanisms. So I think people saw it as a substitute for Christian spiritual practice rather than as a complement to it. I think the second reason is that people feel like that this is a spiritual problem, like you said at the beginning of the show. And if I take medication, I am not trusting the Lord, and I'm failing to deal with this the way I should spiritually. And this comes from a horrible understanding of a human person. It fails to take into account Romans 6 and the role of the members of the body in sanctification. And medications can help with that.
Okay.
That's why
Good deal.
That's why I think that the church has been averse to that. It's changing. Biola is not that way. We have Rosemead School of Psychology and so on. But I know some of our listeners may be hesitant to take medication, and I would ask them to just give me a fair hearing. That's all I'm asking. Read my defense of medication. If you don't agree, that's fine. But at least give me a chance.
Yeah. You should never dismiss. Well, maybe not never, but almost never dismiss views out of hand without trying to give it a fair hearing. So,
yes.
Okay. Now, it also seemed to me when I was just thinking about your book after I got through it, that behind pretty much all of your advice, everything you were doing, there was some kind of an assumption of purpose, or maybe we could say teleology. That is, that things actually do and can matter. And you illustrated this pretty well with that example of flipping over the Monopoly board in chapter 6, which was also kind of funny. I enjoyed that. So do you actually think having some kind of a sense of purpose in your life is necessary to overcoming things like anxiety and depression, or is it even possible to overcome them without them? And this could tie into other psychological things like learned helplessness, where from what I've learned, there's some data that suggests that when people get a sense that what they do doesn't matter, they just kind of stop doing things and are hopelessly depressed.
There you go. I think you're absolutely right. I think knowing that there is purpose is absolutely necessary for getting well. And knowing, first of all, that there's a purpose for why everything is here and why I'm here. That I am here not by accident, but I have a purpose. There's also a redemptive purpose to my anxiety and my disorder. Doesn't mean God caused it, but it can be redeemed. It can work together for good. So thank God I could actually get some purpose out of this. That doesn't mean we don't try to get better, but it does mean that we also can grow. A friend said to me, in every circumstance, you're either going to be formed or deformed. And I want to be formed. I want to be deformed spiritually. And so purpose, brother, is so key. And when atheists have these problems, they latch on to short-term purposes like a promotion at work or accumulating things or having being famous or whatever it might be, which are just ultimately meaningless if the universe doesn't mean anything. But
yeah. It's maybe you can get some short-term pleasure, but it's not going to matter in 100 years.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. I really like what you're saying there about you're either being, was it formed or deformed and everything?
That's right.
I'm part of a book group where we read some stuff, and we've been working through some stuff that C.S. Lewis wrote, and he's says much the same thing using different words, where with everything you're doing, you're either getting yourself a little closer to God or a little further away. So
there you go.
Yeah. Okay, now this one's kind of a minor point, but I enjoyed it. I'm a man who enjoys a good glass of scotch, as you can see right now.
You're the man.
So, well, thank you. Yeah. So I really liked your point in chapter 5 that the Bible doesn't actually teach total abstinence from alcohol, and at the risk of opening a huge can of worms, and I might get some angry emails about this, but so what? Why do you think that so many people actually think it does teach total abstinence from alcohol when there's passages like the ones you cite in your book, and there's other ones that I could point to that clearly seem to at least praise the use of alcohol in some circumstances?
Well, about 15 years ago or so, maybe a little longer, Biola was a school that required its faculty and staff to abstain from alcohol. The board asked us to revisit that, and there was not a single New Testament or Old Testament scholar or biblical scholar or theologian at Talbot School of Theology, which is a solid evangelical school, that could biblically support abstinence. And so the changed. Now we're free to drink as the Bible gives us that freedom in the first place. And there's a book called What Would Jesus Drink? And there are two of them. And if you get it, get the one with a beer mug on the front of it, not the other one. I can't remember the author's name. And there are two of them with the same title. He makes a rigorous case that abstinence, people who abstain, unless they're addicted, that's another thing.
Yeah.
But people who abstain because they think that's the moral thing to do, he points out, almost always, with rare exceptions, commit the much greater sin of being legalistic and judgmental towards those who do drink than drinking itself, even if drinking were sinful. It would be as bad as legalistic judgmentalism, and we know Jesus went after that regularly. I think during the bootleg days, I think alcohol got associated with organized crime, and the church reacted and threw the baby out with the bathwater. And some Christians have never recovered from that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I got my undergraduate degree from Evangel University, which is a evangelical school, and they're still, as far as I know, dry. So
Yeah, I've been there. I know. Yeah.
yeah, good school. I enjoyed it, but
I like the school, but they're not, in my view, they're just not right on that one.
I agree with you, and I've argued about that with some other people, and a classmate of mine from Evangel. I was actually at a wedding with him just this last weekend, and he's working as a youth pastor, and he says, well, I abstained because of the situation I'm in as a youth pastor and things like that. But then the night before the wedding, he came out to the bar and hung out with all of us and just didn't drink. And I was like, well, I can respect that because you're trying to take a stance that you think is appropriate to where the position you're in as a youth pastor. And so that's good.
Yeah, I get that. That's right.
Exactly. Okay. So, I guess this is kind of like if you could wrap up your book in just a few minutes, which I know as somebody who's written long things, I hate it when people ask you to do this, so I apologize in advance. But if you could give advice to someone who's struggling from anxiety or depression, and if you only had a couple of minutes, what would that be? What do you think would help them the most?
Inventory your life and get rid of all the stress you can. See a counselor and see a doctor if medication might be right for you, and then realize that you can form new habits if you practice certain things that I lay out in the book.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be it.
Oh, hey, that was really quick. That was awesome.
Yeah. So I would elaborate a little bit more, but it's a learned habit. You can unlearn it by new practices. That'll take time.
Okay. Now, I wanted to ask you about a couple other things that relate to what you talk about in the book. But before we get into that, did you have any other things you just wanted to talk about in the book directly, or?
Well, no, I just have been kind of overwhelmed at the response, to be honest. And it's my wife and I have actually teared up over some of the reviews on Amazon. I'm just thankful that I didn't waste my suffering.
Oh,
I was able to use it for the kingdom, so.
Yeah, well, even as somebody who doesn't really struggle with anxiety very much, like when things don't go my way, I don't get anxious, I get angry, so I've got a whole other problem to deal with.
Sure.
But even somebody like me, I greatly enjoyed the book and benefited from it, so I can't even begin to imagine how good it is for people who do have those struggles. So,
thanks.
Okay, so the first related question I wanted to ask you is how anxiety may or may not fit in with evolutionary theory, because I know you're a gentleman who's skeptical of evolutionary theory. You've written on that. You were a contributor and editor to that book, Theistic Evolution, a Critique, which I've got a copy of. And I was talking to a up-and-coming Christian apologist just last week who's got a very successful YouTube channel who's a theistic evolutionist. And I brought this up to him because my wife and I have talked about it, but it seems, at least to me, that possibly some aspects of anxiety might qualify as evidence for evolution, because it makes sense why, if our species evolved a long time ago when there were predators after us, why we'd be very anxious, because it's less costly to get it wrong and be anxious than it is to assume that sound isn't a tiger coming to kill you when it really is. But now we live in a time where bump in the night isn't likely, very unlikely it's something that's coming to kill you, so our systems are overreacting. So how would you respond to that? Do you think that could be evidence, or?
Yes, two things. First of all, in order for that to count as evidence for evolution, you have to be able to explain the origin of consciousness. Evolution will never be able to do that in principle, because it's the wrong kind of explanation. And so our theistic evolutionary friend is helping himself to consciousness, because anxiety is a state of consciousness. It has a certain feel to it. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask him, hold it, I'm not going to give you, I'm not giving you anxiety yet. How do you explain the origin of mental states? Okay, so that would be a problem. Number two, this just proves that evolution is a just so story that can, like a wax nose, it can be twisted any direction to explain anything. Your explanation does show that evolution is supported by anxiety. But now let me give you another alternative. If evolution were true, I would predict that in the face of danger, animals would not get anxious, they would become alert, because anxiety can be counterproductive. It can cause you to freeze, an animal to freeze. It can cause it not to see things the way they are. And so anxiety can actually be a falsifier of evolution, because if evolution were true, one would expect a much more helpful trait to evolve than anxiety. That's overkill. Those would be two things I'd say.
So if I understood what you're getting at, you're saying in a certain sense, evolution isn't a good explanatory mechanism there, because you can use it to explain all kinds of things, and sometimes those explanations are contradictory, but you could still appeal to evolution in both cases.
The history of the theory.
Definitely.
They thought certain things were true, and so they used evolution to explain it. Later, they found out that wasn't, in fact, true of the organism, and they used evolution to explain that. So, I mean, how is that supposed to work?
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I'm going through a whole series on the podcast where I'm interviewing people on science creation and evolution and things like that. So that'll be something I'll keep asking people about. So
thank you.
Okay. And the last related question I wanted to ask is, I listened to your book on my way out to Denver. I live in Missouri, driving my family. And then on my way back, I listened to Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And I thought there were some interesting parallels between your book and his, which I did not expect, because they're at surface level so different on topics. But part of Haidt's thesis was that some colleges are teaching students actually the opposite of good cognitive behavioral therapy by encouraging things like emotional reasoning, fragility, the false dichotomy that people are either all good or all evil. He actually even mentions catastrophizing, which you mentioned before, of just taking things to the extreme. And he also cites a lot of data that indicates that there's been a massive rise of mental health problems on many colleges' campuses.
That's right.
So it occurred to me that you mentioned in the book things about how a secular culture encourages that sense of purposelessness, the opposite of what we were talking about earlier. So if you're right about that, then a student would go to this campus and they'd be hit with these behaviors that encourage these ideas and things, and then they're basically being hit with a double whammy. So since you're a college professor yourself and you've done research on anxiety, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that if you have any comments.
I absolutely do. I've met Haidt. He came to Biola and lectured, and I just think he's great.
I didn't know that. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and he's absolutely right, because the kinds of things that are taught with regard to social justice, microaggressions, and so on are creating people that are engaging in some of the thought distortions that I list in the book. And it's making them more vulnerable to anxiety. And the anxiety level is off the charts. And it's got to be explained by something. And this is a good part of the explanation. By the way, before we close, where do you live in Missouri?
Oh, I live in Bolivar, Missouri. It's about 30 minutes north of Springfield, Missouri.
I was raised in Grandview, born and raised in Grandview, Missouri. And I'll be in the Ozarks this summer vacationing. And I love Missouri.
Yeah, the Ozarks is a good place to vacation. I've spent time at Lake of the Ozarks. My wife and I will periodically go down to Branson because it's so easy to find a good condo to rent down there, and eat at College of the Ozarks and good stuff like that. So.
Oh yeah, you bet.
Yeah, and go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, and you might not remember this, but I actually got you to autograph a book of mine. Well, I own the book, but it's one that you wrote when you were in Columbia, Missouri a few years ago for a Biola apologetics conference. I came up there to see all the great philosophers that were speaking and introduced myself to you, and you were gracious enough to autograph a book for me, and it was very nice to meet you then. So
not at all. Well, thank you for reminding me of that. I wish you well. I appreciate brothers like you. Keep up the good fight and just continue doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you being willing to come out and talk to me. It's a great pleasure to have a conversation with you, Dr. Moreland. You're one of the people who actually got me into philosophy. I did my undergraduate in English, and in my senior level stuff, we started getting into postmodern nonsense in language theory. And about that time, I came across a lecture you did explaining how you can be a Christian just through reason alone. And
Yep.
I was like, oh, I got to get into doing this type of stuff. So that's what got me into philosophy. So it's wonderful to talk to you.
Yeah, you too, my brother, and God bless.
Yeah, likewise. Same to you, Dr. Moreland. Thanks again. Okay, so that's the extent of Dr. Moreland and I's discussion. And as I'm sure you've noticed, it wasn't a full hour. Dr. Moreland could only spare me about 30 minutes of time, but he graciously went over and did even a few more minutes to talk with me. And so I really, really appreciate that. So to round out and bring this up to about the length of an hour, I thought some good additional information I would give here is some of these arguments for why we can know that the mind or the soul is immaterial, that there's an immaterial aspect to human beings, because that is a pretty prominent, I'd say, not assumption, because he actually argues for it, but that's definitely something that's very much at work in Dr. Moreland's book, Finding Quiet, is a lot of what he's arguing for there is dependent upon there actually being both an immaterial aspect to human beings and a material aspect. And if you go into many aspects of popular level philosophy, psychology, or biology, it's very often argued or simply assumed that we're all material, that the mind and everything is completely material. There is no immaterial soul or mind or aspect to human beings. And we didn't really have time, as he mentioned in our conversation, to go in depth on those arguments. So I'll just go through here and give you a couple of arguments that I think prove that there has to be an immaterial aspect to human beings, whether you want to call it the mind, the soul, the will, all kinds of various things. There's a lot of good philosophers of mind, such as Dr. Moreland, who get very, very in-depth in distinguishing between this part's the soul, this part's the will, this part's the mind, and trying to pull them all together. There's, I think, Thomas Aquinas made a distinction between the intellect and the will, and things along those lines, and I don't really want to get into the minutia there. All I'm trying to argue for in these arguments is there's an immaterial aspect to human beings. There's something about us that is not reducible to material. So, a few background points here that need to be talked about. There's a couple of distinctions and clarifications that I need to make before I can talk about these arguments. There's a distinction between a thing and the states that thing can be in. So, for example, water is always water, but it could be liquid, solid, or gas. So there's a distinction between what a thing is and the states of that thing. Second, from the law of identity, which I talked about last week when I discussed Aristotle, we know that if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A will be equal to C. That is, we can say, if two things share the same and identical properties, then those two things are the same thing. For example, right now, the current U.S. president and Donald Trump have exactly the same properties. The two are the same thing, and that's kind of a benign example that doesn't really seem all that interesting. But a sub-point of that is, if two things don't have the same properties, then there's a distinction there. They're not the same thing. And so the first argument for the immateriality of the soul or the mind, I'm going to use the terms interchangeably here, even though that's not philosophically precise. The first argument here is that the immaterial soul or mind has properties that the body does not have, hence we know that the two are not the same thing. Now, just to define my terms here, I might have covered it in a previous podcast, but a property is just something that a thing has, or what it's about. So water has the properties of being wet and freezing at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, being composed of oxygen and hydrogen. I have the properties of being male, living in Missouri, really liking coffee, as everyone who listens knows, of being a philosopher, of being human, of being married to my wife, and so on. Now, every conscious state has what it is like to be in that stateness to it. Conscious states consistently flow and change. Your mind is constantly thinking about this, then moving on to that, and moving on to that, and so on and so forth. Conscious states have the property of what we would call intentionality. That is, they are about something or directed at something. You might want to call this like ofness or aboutness. Brain states aren't about anything. A brain state is just a physical reality. It's the measurement of how the cells in your brain are arranged and how the electrons are firing and things like that. But it's not about anything. It's not any more about anything than, say, a rock is about anything. States of the brain don't have the property of being about or being directed to something other than themselves. And so remember, back to the law of identity there, Since your thoughts have the property of intentionality and your brain states don't, the two are not the same. They're not identical. Further, brain states are always structural in that they have parts and components and can be broken down into those parts and components. You can look at what your left brain is doing and what your right brain is doing. You could break it down even further. We could take your brain out of your skull and chop it up and dissect it, although we really shouldn't do that since it would kill you, and that is a moral problem, but it could be done. But you can't do that with your thoughts and your conscious states. They're not divisible like that. You can't take a mental state and break it down into parts and divide it. You can't chop it up. A single thought is indivisible, while a single brain state is quite clearly divisible. Now, the further argument here is that there's something more to knowing than simply knowing facts. That is, we could say that a blind person could know all the physical facts of what it takes to see, but still not know what the actual experience is of seeing. That is, you could, at least in theory, know every part of the physical process about how humans see. You could look at the cellular interactions, how the light is captured by the eye, how the light reflects off objects, and you could know all the physical details of that, even down to the chemical reactions inside the cells themselves, and the signals they're sending with each other, and all that complicated stuff. Now, there's no reason a blind person can't know that. But would that blind person then know what it's like to see? Well, pretty obviously no. There's something more to seeing than simply knowing the facts about seeing. And that should demonstrate that you can't explain seeing simply by you can't explain the conscious experience of seeing something simply by knowing all the physical facts about eyesight. The great philosopher Thomas Nagel actually wrote a very excellent essay arguing this point called What It's Like to Be a Bat. Now, his point is very much the same that I just made about eyesight. He argues that we could know everything physical about what bats are like, but we still wouldn't know what it is like to be the bat. We wouldn't get to experience the world as the bat does. But see, if consciousness is only physical, if we are just material, there is no immaterial aspect to the mind or the soul, that should be impossible. If consciousness is only physical, all you'd have to know is all the physical facts of the bat, and you would know exactly what it's like to be a bat. There's other examples of this or variants of this argument that are used all the time. The eyesight one is sometimes used with a blind scientist who is in a lab testing everything and knows everything about eyesight, then walks to the lab and sees for the first time. And the way it's put there is, if you think the scientist knows something new at that point, when they actually see for the first time, then consciousness has to be immaterial. And you can get examples of that with, I think I heard somebody talk about it with tasting a strawberry one time, where the scientist knows everything about the process of taste and what strawberries are like chemically, but they've never tasted one before, and then they finally taste one. Well, do they know something new? Again, it seems to me obviously that they then know the experience of tasting a strawberry, whereas before they didn't. And that demonstrates there's something immaterial about the mind or the soul. Now, there's another argument here, which I don't think this one will convince very many people. It probably won't be very persuasive, but it is logically sound. And that is that the soul could potentially exist without the body or the brain, but the body could never exist without the body. And that is, it's not possible for my body to survive without my body, or my brain to survive without my brain. That's just nonsense. Clear contradiction, clear problem there. But it's a perfectly coherent idea that my soul, or my immaterial self, could exist without my body. And so once again, going back to the law of identity, my soul, or my immaterial mind, has a property that my body does not. It has the property of could potentially survive without my body, where clearly my body doesn't have that property. And you don't just see this conception in religion, philosophy of religion, theology, and things like that. It actually shows up all the time in science fiction and fantasy stories. Ever hear, read, or watch a story where a person switches bodies with another person, or where an individual survives the death of their body by having their mind transferred into a computer or some other machine? That's an example of that idea. Now, the fiction, of course, here, fictional stories don't prove that it's actually the case. What they prove is that this is a coherent idea. There's nothing prima facie incoherent about the idea that my soul can survive the death of my body. There's nothing about it that's just obviously, blatantly contradictory right on the surface. And that's the different property there, because there obviously is something prima facie on the face of it contradictory and incoherent about saying my body will survive the destruction of my body. But there's not in saying my soul could at least survive the destruction or death of my body. So we can conceive of a soul existing without its original body, but we can never conceive of a body existing without itself. And the argument here is that's a property that the soul or the immaterial mind has that the body does not. A further argument I've been attempting to touch on here, but I haven't spelled out explicitly, is that thoughts themselves are not material things. Now, by the very nature of being a human being, you're pretty well aware, very much intimately aware of two things. That is, what your thoughts are and what matter is. You're very aware of thoughts because as a human being you have them, and you're very aware of matter and have a pretty good understanding of that because virtually everything you interact with, absent your own thoughts, is made of matter. That is, you're very familiar with what's material, and you're very familiar with your thoughts. Thus, you're in a pretty good position to know, just intuitively, that matter always has what Aristotle termed magnitude, and what he meant by that is it has size, it has extension, it's located in a specific time and place, you can touch it, you can point at it. There's a way you can say, there it is, there's the table, there's the chair, there's the computer or phone you're using to listen to my podcast. It has magnitude, it's located somewhere. These types of things are always composed of matter and always have size and location. But thoughts have neither. Thoughts are indivisible, as I covered before. Well, everything that's made of matter can be divided. But your thoughts also don't have a location in the sense. Like some people would want to identify them as being in your brain, but where in your brain would they be? You can't open up your brain and pull them out. You can't point to a thought and say, there it is in physical space, because a thought isn't really a physical thing. And there's some more technical arguments you can get into this, but I want to just immediately appeal to everyone's immediate experience of their own lives and say, you just, obviously, if you stop and think about it, can recognize your thoughts aren't material because you know what material things are. You know what matter is. That's what you interact with all the time. And you know what thoughts are because you have them all the time. Well, yeah, you definitely have thoughts and you're a thinking person if you're listening to my podcast anyway. There might be some people in the world who don't think, but they're not going to be listening to my podcast. So as I said, there are many, many more arguments that demonstrate that thoughts and matter are not the same thing, but you really only need one of them to work to just prove that that's the case. So the materialist, that is somebody who denies that there's an immaterial aspect to human beings, they think that everything we are and have is reducible to just the material, and usually they would say it's in the human brain that you find the mind, not somewhere else in the body. Well, to get around these things, they're going to either have to do one of two things, which is they're going to have to deny these very facts about matter and thoughts, which seems very counterintuitive and quite difficult to do because you just know what matter and thoughts are because you're a human being, or they've got to deny the very rules of logic, in which case they become, by definition, irrational. Now, there's a slightly better variant of this here that is very, very popular in philosophy and philosophy of mind today, and that's emergentism, and I talked about that with Michael Jones in the past couple of weeks, so I'm sure if you've been listening, you're pretty familiar with this. But loosely speaking, emergentists do actually think that the mind or soul has an immaterial component. There's something about it that isn't reducible to the matter, but they think that it arises from increasing complexity of that material. That is something like a brain or possibly an exceptionally advanced computer. The immaterial mind just arises from the material there. Now, as I've mentioned a couple of times, and last week when I was talking about Aristotle, I think the trouble this view runs into is that it's attempting to ground or explain the immaterial thoughts as arising or emerging from the states of matter. And this aspect of emergentism seems to deny the very well-established fact that all of humanity has never once observed something immaterial arising from something material. That's never something we've observed, and I actually think you could probably go even further, as I did last week, and say there's something very contradictory about this idea. The immaterial and the material are, by definition, not each other, so to say the one comes from the other is extremely counterintuitive. And it also seems to deny an even better established rule of logic and thinking, which is that an effect can never be greater than its cause. And, for example here, it works fine for God to be, in many senses, the effective cause of my existence just because he's so much greater than I. And you can refer back to Aristotle's four causes for what I mean by effective cause. Now, the reverse does not work. That is, I can't be the cause of God because he's so much greater than I am. But the emergentist would face an even larger problem than I do if I wanted to argue that, say, I was the cause of God. Because, at least in the case of God, God and I are alike in some senses. That is, both God and I are persons. Both of us have thoughts and emotions. We both have reason, and many, many other things like that. So even if I wanted to do that kind of stupid backwards thinking where there's at least some similarities there. It's not like there's an obvious contradiction there. There's problems and it's never going to work, and I'm certainly not the cause of God. But it's not quite as big a leap as it is to say the immaterial arose from the material. They are not alike in any way at all. The definition of the one necessarily excludes the definition of the other. So to argue that the immaterial simply arises from the material, as the emergentist does, defies logical thinking and all of human experience and all of our observations of the physical world, that is, physics. So, to start summing up here, the basic argument here is this. My mind and my body are the same thing if and only if they share all the same properties. And you could reduce that to my mind and my brain are the same thing if and only if they have all the same properties, and that's probably a little bit fairer. But my mind has properties that my body does not, and my body has properties that my mind does not. Therefore, my mind and my body are not identical. They are not the same thing. And hence, there's an immaterial aspect to human beings. There's something about us that's not material. Now, if you're very interested in this stuff, as I alluded to when I was talking to him, Dr. Moreland is a very prolific and well-respected philosopher of mind. He's written many books on this. He's got an argument for the existence of God in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology called The Argument from Consciousness. Great essay. I'd recommend you check that out. And look at many of the other aspects of philosophy of mind if this interests you. I hope to one day do some podcasts on philosophy of mind, just as I'm focused on the problem of divine foreknowledge, and I'm doing creation evolution now, because it's a pretty interesting topic and would be worth exploring. So let me know what you thought of this week's podcast. Did you enjoy hearing Dr. Moreland talk about his book? I know I very much enjoyed talking with him, and I really, really appreciate that he was able to spare me the time. The only thing I wish is that we'd have had 2 or 3 hours to talk instead of the time we did, but I always wish that about good philosophical conversations. So write and let me know what you think. If you're somebody who struggles with anxiety or depression at all, I recommend highly that you pick up Dr. Moreland's book, Finding Quiet, and give it a read. It could definitely help you out. As I said to him, I found a lot of benefit in it, even as somebody who doesn't struggle from anxiety. So if you do, give it a read and check it out. And as always, write in, let me know what you think of the show. You can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com or leave a comment on the Facebook group, The Examined Life with Phil. And if you like the podcast here and what I'm doing, you liked hearing from Dr. Moreland, share it on your social media, give it likes and reviews on the podcast app you use. It helps it get out to more people. All right, so that's the end of this week's episode, and I'll be back next week when David Pullman should be giving us a presentation on intelligent design. So be back then. Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.